Is the Bible reliable? Can we trust what it says to be true? To answer this question, we must get a proper understanding of the Jewish culture in the first century. The religious teachings, laws, and traditions were tremendously sacred to the ancient Jewish people. Young Jewish boys, even at the age of 5, would begin their education at the local synagogue, studying Hebrew and memorizing the Torah. By the time of his bar mitzvah at age 13, a typical Jewish young man would have committed the entire Torah to memory. That's the first 5 books of Moses in the Old Testament: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. An average scroll of the Torah would be about 124 feet long. It was a culture where religious truth was paramount. To err in the speaking and writing of it was of grave consequence. Jewish students were trained to retain every bit of their teaching from their rabbis. They were to be as astute pupils likened to a plastered cistern that loses not a drop. Jesus' disciples would have remembered this training that they received as young students, knowing that accurately transmitting religious truth was of utmost importance. Within the New Testament, we have 4 accounts of the life of Christ. They are referred to as Gospels, written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Matthew and John were both 2 of Jesus' closest followers among the 12 disciples. Mark wrote his Gospel from what he received from the Apostle Peter, one of the 12. Luke was a doctor and a historian, and also a disciple of the Apostle Paul. As we examine the text, we can see very clearly that accurately transcribing truth and the life and message of Jesus would have been of utmost importance to these men. Luke begins his gospel writing to a man named Theophilus. He says, "Many have undertaken to write an orderly account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know with certainty the things you have been taught." Notice what words Luke uses here. He has carefully investigated everything, writing an orderly account, so that you may know with certainty the things you have been taught. This is the type of accuracy these men used in writing their accounts. They were not just whimsically writing down some things that might have been true and might have been myth. Peter says in his second epistle, "We were not making up clever stories when we told you about the powerful coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. We saw his majestic splendor with our own eyes." Peter makes it clear that he had seen these things with his own eyes. John also says that he was an eyewitness to the person of Christ, as he says, "We proclaim to you what we ourselves have actually seen and heard, so that you may have fellowship with us, and our fellowship is with the Father and with his Son, Jesus Christ." He says, "We proclaim to you what we have actually seen." Luke also wrote the 5th book in the New Testament called the Book of Acts, or the Acts of the Apostles. This book is about what took place in the lives of the apostles after the life of Christ. He is writing with great historical accuracy. In the last 140 years, there has been tremendous criticism about the accuracy of the New Testament documents, claiming that they can't be trusted. Sir William Ramsay was among these critics, who is one of the greatest archaeologists ever to have lived. He was taught that the Book of Acts could not be a trusted source of what took place at that time, about AD 50. Therefore, he did not use the New Testament documents during his research of the history of Asia Minor, but his investigation eventually compelled him to consider the writings of Luke. The archaeologist observed the meticulous accuracy of the historical details in Luke's writing, and it led him to say this: "Luke is a historian of the first rank. This author should be placed along with the very greatest of historians." William Ramsay was a student of F.C. Bauer, who was a German critic who started the Tübingen School of Theology. It was a school focused on critical scholarship of theological history. Essentially, they taught that the Gospels could not be trusted accounts of the life of Christ because they were written at a much later date. They claim about 150 to 170 AD, and therefore they could not have been written by Jesus' disciples. But years of their critical scholarship was thrown out the window when earlier manuscripts of the New Testament were discovered. For example, a manuscript fragment of the Gospel of John was found in Egypt that dates about 100 to 125 AD. It's called the P52 fragment. It cites a small section of John chapter 18. Just an ounce of evidence destroyed a pound of presumption upon the finding of the P52 fragment. But what does it mean that we found a manuscript fragment of the Gospel of John dated about 125 AD? This manuscript fragment is most likely a copy of a copy of a copy, which means that the original must have been written much earlier, possibly between 80 and 90 AD, which means it was most likely indeed written by the Apostle John, who lived into his old age. Just about all scholars agree, Christian and non-Christian, that John was the last gospel to be written, Mark and Matthew the earliest gospels. We can gain a lot of detail from the writings of Luke, who wrote the book of Acts. In the book of Acts, Luke is recording events that take place after Jesus died. Much of his writing is during his journey with the Apostle Paul. We know that from secular history in 70 AD, the Roman army destroyed the city of Jerusalem, burning it to the ground. No doubt Luke is writing before that takes place, because he most certainly would have written about Israel's capital city being destroyed if that happened during his writing. He does not mention Paul's death, which we know takes place in the mid-60s, so Luke most likely finished his writing in the early 60s. We know that Luke wrote his gospel before Acts because he mentions it in Acts chapter 1. In the first book, O Theophilus, I have dealt with all that Jesus began to do and teach. This means that the Gospel of Luke could have been written possibly in the late 50s, which means that Matthew and Mark could have been written as early as the early 50s. Jesus was crucified in AD 33. That means the first accounts of the life of Christ were most likely written within 20 years of his death. Right now, as I'm speaking, it's the year 2021, 20 years after the planes flew into the Twin Towers on 9/11. That's what we call an impact event. I can remember exactly where I was and what I was doing when I heard that those planes hit the towers. I was in school at the time. I remember what classroom I was in. I remember who the teacher was. I remember some of the students in the class. Do you think Jesus rising from the dead would be an impact event that people would remember well? Do you think seeing someone give sight to the blind, raising up the lame, or walking on water would be events in which people could remember certain details 20 years later? Absolutely. Myths and legends are formed over centuries, not within a matter of 20 or 30 years. The most reasonable conclusion is that these men were writing what they had seen and heard, and these accounts of the life of Christ are trustworthy. But how can we know what was written in the first century is what we have in our Bibles today? How do we know it hasn't changed over time? We know this through a process called textual criticism. We don't have any original writings of the New Testament documents, what we call the autographs, but we have thousands of manuscript copies that we have found over the centuries. Over 66,000 manuscript copies and scrolls of the Old and New Testament documents, over 5,000 manuscripts of the New Testament written in the original language, far and away the most of any ancient work that we have found. The second most is Homer's Iliad at about 1,800 manuscripts, and the first copy we have is well over 1,000 years after the original date written. The first New Testament manuscript that we have is within 100 years of the original. Textual criticism is the scholarly work of taking the manuscript copies and analyzing them to recover what was in the original manuscript. This is a very accurate way to deduce what was in the original. To give an example of the process, if you gave a classroom of students all a copy of the U.S. Constitution and told them to handwrite a copy of it, certainly throughout the classroom you would have a fair amount of variance in their handwritten copies. Misspelled words, maybe words missing or added. Possibly a student or two decided to be mischievous and handwrite whatever he wanted. But if you gathered up all those copies, you very easily can conclude what was in the original by comparing and contrasting them. This is exactly the process that takes place with biblical manuscripts, but instead of a classroom of copies to examine, we have over 66,000. And in one sense, it's actually better that we don't have the original New Testament manuscripts, because if we had the original, someone could alter it. But you can never alter the original if only manuscripts remain. If someone tried to change the text, we would know, because it would not match the manuscripts that we have. This is the beauty of textual criticism. But even more, we have the writings of the early church fathers that cite almost every verse in the New Testament documents. We know that Ignatius and Polycarp were disciples of the Apostle John. Polycarp would disciple Irenaeus, and Irenaeus would go on to disciple a man named Hippolytus, and so on. We have writings from guys like Papias, Clement of Rome, Justin Martyr, and others. Even if we didn't have the New Testament manuscripts, we could completely recover what was in the New Testament from the writings of the early church fathers alone. With all this evidence, we can say with great certainty that what we have in our Bibles today is a very accurate depiction of what was originally written by the apostles in the first century. Therefore, we can reasonably conclude that the New Testament documents are very reliable, and the facts that they proclaim about Jesus are trustworthy and true.